Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm happy to chair this panel on innovation and competition in the pharma sector. So the good news is we're not going to talk about the DMA. We're going to talk about a real thing that saves people's lives, actually. I'll start before I introduce the panelists to frame a bit the discussion. So clearly, the pharma sector innovation is not merely a feature of competition. It's actually one of the central dimensions sitting alongside price competition. And that we can see or can clearly illustrate the tension that there exists between potentially, or the potential tension that exists between price level and innovation. We know that we have quite a few regulatory interventions in that sector that affect how innovation works. We have a patent framework which grants innovators a period of market exclusivity that allow them to recoup uncertain and irreversible costs of drug development. And clearly, the price of drugs during that period of market exclusivity is typically high. That's obviously static inefficiencies. But in exchange of these static inefficiencies, we get dynamic investment for tomorrow's innovation. And that's precisely the trade-off that competition and regulatory authority must navigate. On the one hand, allowing some short-term price static inefficiencies for potential long-term benefit, ensuring that essentially we obtain better medicine for the future. So whilst innovation is certainly something that matters in every sector, I think there is clearly an important case here to focus on innovation in the pharma sector. And the reason is that we've seen, the data is certainly confirming for decades that the pharma sectors has invested billions and billions in R&D development. And what we also know, and that's well documented, that research in the pharma sector is quite actually risky. Attrition rate is brutal. So you can find out there if you search around the percentage about the failures of drug development, but a very small percentage actually of what is being undertaken make it to the end. So the sunk costs are a real thing in the pharma sector, and it's important to keep this in mind and maintain the willingness of firms to invest in the next generation of therapies, and that willingness to invest necessarily will depend on the expected returns that firms will expect from the one drugs that would succeed. So when you are thinking about intervention in that space, changing either regulatory the rules of regulation or thinking about merger control, you need to think about whether those changes will erode those returns, because there is a risk, and not a small one, that that could lead to a reduction in investment in the next wave of innovation. Okay, so let me just say very few words about the regulatory architectures. That's already quite well known, but talk a little bit about how authorities have intervened around this, and then talk very briefly about mergers, and then I'll let the panelists intervene. So we know that the patent system is quite central, is a central instrument to sustain pharmaceutical innovation. Okay, so we have this market exclusivity that originator benefit for a certain amount of time to recoup their investment. Now, it's understood that, and it's been acknowledged that regulatory approval consumes a significant portion of the statutory patent terms. So both in the EU and the US, they have developed extensions. So we have in the US, you have the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984, which introduced patent term extension. And similarly, you have a similar system in the EU where essentially you extend the effective exclusivity of the patent for the pharma sector. Now, one thing that is clear is that once a patent is in the public domain, generic enters, and that leads to a massive drop in prices, and that's very well documented. Now, as a result of this, you could argue that, originator may have had a willingness to extend the exclusivity, and competition authority have looked in that space quite carefully, and with good reason, because originator may have found a way or devised a range of strategy to extend effective exclusivity well beyond what the patent system was designed to provide. So there is documentation around filing secondary patent on reformulation, new dosing regimen, method of administration that creates some sort of what we call a patent thicket around a product that make it difficult for generic to navigate. There's also switching patient to a reformulated product just before the patent expire, which can disrupt the substitution on which generic entry depend. There's also a famous case of paying generic to delay entry. Those were the pay for delay cases that we found in the US and in the EU. So authority are well aware of those, and they have intervened in making sure that abuses to extend the patent system were not effective. On the side of merger control, MA activity in the pharma sector is quite important. And we see it in several ways. First of all, large incumbent always willing to replenish their pipelines of new product. And the way they've done this often was to acquire innovative startup, which themselves were seeking exit through acquisition. So by and large, those deals where a startup is being acquired by an incumbent were likely to be efficiency enhancing. The reason being that, those small companies were not necessarily capable of, putting out to market new drugs. But as we know, the other side of the story was the killer acquisition hypothesis, which was exactly developed in the field of pharma. I'm referring here to the paper by Cunningham et al., which actually identified that whilst there's many acquisitions that are probably very legitimate, there's a small number of acquisitions in the pharma sector which actually fell just below the merger threshold. That may have been actually what we call killer acquisition, i.e. the incumbent wanting to kill off potential innovation that may actually challenge their monopoly reign. This has been documented by Cunningham et al. Also, the Commission has had a study by Lair that was trying to document also this killer acquisition concern in the pharma sector. Now, the Commission has recently published in what I call the competition policy brief of the propaganda magazine of the Commission, which is always have this disclaimer: this never represent the view of the author, but we all know it's approved by the Director General anyway to publish there. They helpfully set out how they would go a framework to assess innovation competition in the pharma sector, and there's a 4-layer framework, which is not nothing that is completely surprising. So they have the way they look at it is essentially the 4-layer goes like this. You have the first layer, which is a traditional horizontal concern. The two pharma companies are essentially overlapping on products that are already on the market. So nothing new there. It's the traditional unilateral story. Then there is the second layer, which is a bit more upstream, where here the potential is examining potential competition through late-stage pipeline overlap. So product. So that means the drugs is in phase 3 or close to become there. Just to clarify things, it's not because your product is in phase 3 that is going to make it to the market. There's still a chance that they are not going to actually satisfy. More than half actually don't. Then you have the third layers, which is basically when the Commission looks at early stage development, where essentially we look at preclinical or early clinical stage compounds and whether there is the parties are active in that space. And then the fourth and most demanding layer is the concept of innovation space, which is the concept that Greg is familiar with because this is the Dow-DuPont capability. This 3 times apparently in the Dow-DuPont decision, according to Nicolas. In any event, so this is the stage where we talk innovation space, which is much more difficult to delineate, and where, at least when it comes to pharma, we know the probability of success is quite low. And so the Commission has essentially giving us basically a framework to tell us how they would examine mergers in the pharma space. Now, obviously, this looking only at the anti-competitive story. Merger analysis will also require that we look at the other side of the ledger. So whether combining the parties' capability accelerate innovation, and whilst the Commission guidelines acknowledge efficiencies, it's difficult to see at the current draft, and we'll see whether the new draft merger guidelines give us a proper framework to assess innovation efficiency difference in the context of the pharma sector in particular. And I'm not going to talk about capabilities. We'll see whether that makes the light of the day. So against this backdrop, and sorry for being too long, let me turn to our three speakers. So first we will have Jonathan Barnett, who is a professor of law at the University of Southern California, who specializes in antitrust and intellectual property, innovation law, and policy. And he will speak about IP foundation in the pharma sectors. Then we have Bowman Heiden, who is a common feature in this space, in this area, and a faculty director, UC Berkeley Open Innovation Labs. That works for you, Bo? No, I didn't say that. And you would tell us more about, talk about innovation and in merger analysis in the pharma sector, and making some reference to Illumina Grail in particular. And then Kristina Nordlander, who is now a partner at McDermott, Will & Emery. And Kristina will tell us a bit more about the implication of the Commission ongoing merger guidelines review on the sector. So without further ado, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. As always, it's a true pleasure to be here. So I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity. As was mentioned, intellectual property, the patent system, and various other legal exclusivities are key to the biopharmaceutical system. So to understand competition policy in biopharma, you need to understand the role of IP rights. In fact, I thought that the critical function and the essential function of IP rights was so well understood in the biopharma industry that till a couple of years ago, I had never bothered to even write anything about it. But Bo and I observed that especially, or at least in the US, in the legal academic and the policy literature, there were in fact many voices contesting this proposition. In fact, the most widely cited book on intellectual property published in the last quarter century argues for the complete abolition of the IP system, including in the pharmaceutical industry. A Nobel Prize-winning economist frequently writes that the patent system is unnecessary for pharmaceutical development, despite the fact that I'm aware of not a single business model that does not rely on it. So in order to address what seemed to be a creeping groupthink in this area that was not empirically informed, Bo and I founded about 2 years ago the ERA Initiative under the Berkeley Policy Institute, which is dedicated to supporting empirically informed research on IP and innovation policy in biopharma. We had our first conference in DC last October. We will be having our first European conference in Paris at the end of October, and you'll be hearing all about that. Let me jump into my remarks. All right. So if you look at the legal academic literature, and my presentation will be US focused, but I will be drawing out what I think are some natural applications to the European context. If you look at law reviews, if you look at significant portions of the economics literature, not so much in the business schools, you will find a dismal narrative of the role of patents in biopharma. They unnecessarily impose high prices on consumers. They prolong exclusivity unnecessarily. They even impede innovation through licensing and transaction costs. And that literature tends to focus almost entirely on social costs, specifically that gap that was mentioned. It's easy to see, it's easy to measure, that big price drop from the patented branded drug, then it goes off patent and the generic comes in. That's a big number. It's easy to see. But very little discussion of the social gains, the other side of the cost-benefit equation. In the economics literature specifically, there's grown up an almost cottage industry of substitutes for patents, focusing on using prizes and grants to substitute for the patent system that would be publicly financed. Again, this is despite the fact that, to my knowledge, there is no example in history except for a couple one-shot examples of a fully public financed innovation and development pipeline in pharmaceuticals. Just to give you a sense of the groupthink in the IP policy literature in biopharma, this is showing you leading papers on what's known as the anti-commons thesis. It derives from a 5-page essay in Science magazine published in 1998, which argues that contrary to what we normally expect of real property rights, if you extend patent rights into the biomedical research ecosystem, it will cause an anti-commons, meaning it will cause transaction costs, litigation costs that impede innovation because patents are held by too many holders that can't transact. Innovation slows down. It's a theoretical paper. There are a couple other theoretical papers. What you're seeing here are citations per year since the date of publication of the paper. The theoretical papers that assert or endorse the anti-commons hypothesis keep getting cited over and over. What you're seeing in those little bars that are mostly in black, and they keep getting smaller and smaller until you can't really see them, those are almost all empirical papers where researchers took the time to actually test out through various methodologies, did the extension of patent rights into the biomedical research ecosystem slow down innovation? And the answer in every single case but one, which is in a narrow therapeutic area, is no. Okay? But nonetheless, the anti-commons thesis holds up in the academic literature. Now, who really cares? Well, we only care if this matters in policy, and it does matter in policy, because whether you look on the right, whether you look on the left in the United States, there is a lot of pressure on policymakers to push drug prices down, because as you probably know, drug prices are higher in the US because until recently, under actions taken under both the Biden and Trump administrations, there were few, if any, price controls imposed on branded drugs in the United States, although there's very large, it's the largest market for generics. And as a result, we now do have some significant price controls being implemented under both administrations. Now, that may or may not be a correct policy choice, but in order to evaluate that, we have to understand fully the economic effects of IP rights. And to do that, I'm going to be presenting in the remainder of my presentation the argument that we need to move away from a purely static pricing-focused model of the function of IP rights in pharma markets to a dynamic model. Okay. Now, why should we contemplate ditching the current focus on short-term pricing effects, that difference between branded and generic markets? Because there's significant evidence suggesting that society gets a lot for that patent premium. First, what do pharma firms do with that patent premium on the minority of drugs that pass FDA approval and succeed commercially? Well, they are investing the highest percentage of any industry back into R&D, about 25%. To give you a rough measure of how high that is, Apple only invests slightly more than 5%. Google does better at about 15%. Specialized chip designers like Qualcomm are hovering around 20%. So it's a full quarter going right back into R&D in an iterative R&D cycle. Second, as was mentioned, we're looking at that price premium on the blockbuster drug. Okay, but that's like, I'm coming from LA, that's like looking at the one person in 1,000 who became a Hollywood star. What about the other 999? Those costs have to be covered. The pharma industry model, it's basically, what is a big pharma firm? It's basically a VC for pharma. And so the premium on the blockbuster drug has to cover the costs on that drug, but all the others that failed in early stages and in clinical testing. I also, okay, Can't see the rest, and I don't remember. But there's another good thing that we get that we'll get to. Okay. Now I remember. There's also evidence that the traditional dichotomy or trade-off between innovation incentives and user access, patient access, it's not always true. And the reason why that is the case is that if we compare the US and Europe, one regime with price controls, one regime until recently without. Yes, it's true that prices are higher on existing drugs in the US market until the generics come in. However, it is also true that the US consumer gets newer drugs often before the EU consumer, often many years prior to the EU consumer. I'm not saying that's a correct policy trade-off. However, it is a trade-off that's out there, okay? What is missing in the standard model? Perfectly appropriate for this conference, it's not dynamic. It overlooks two dynamic effects. One is well-known, I won't focus on it. Those are the long-term effects that we get from that pricing premium being plowed back into R&D. We get more drugs. People talk about it. It hasn't been quantified well. It should be. I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on the other dynamic effect, which is the transactional function of patents and other IP rights in the pharma innovation lifecycle. And I want to show you that the property rights enable transactions that wouldn't otherwise exist. They create value that wouldn't otherwise exist. And contrary to the standard tension or dichotomy between IP and competition, for certain firms that play a critical role in innovation in the biotech ecosystem, they lower entry barriers. They make it easier for that firm to come into the market. Okay. So what the static model looks at is when the drug hits market, it enables price to be pushed up well above cost, well above marginal cost, and it's doing that by excluding the imitator from coming in. It's excluding competition. That's your natural IP antitrust dichotomy. But let's back up now and look at every single step in the supply chain. That supply chain, all those boxes I throw up there, right now, lower bound estimate on drug development of a successful drug, including failed projects, in excess of $3 billion, okay? So what's happening there is we need someone to innovate. That's basic research, often government funded, because it's a public good in many respects. But we've got product development, clinical testing, production, distribution. These are hundreds of millions of dollars that are adding up. And in all those steps prior to market release, I want to argue that the IP right enables transactions between entities that are really good at innovation, and they're often smaller, or they're not even in the business world, like universities, and entities that have the economies of scale to produce and distribute. Okay. Let me give you an example from the canonical biotech deal in the US, actually in the world. Okay. Back in the mid-70s, Cohen Boyer team at University of California in Stanford discovered recombinant DNA technology, groundbreaking technology. Stanford at the time breaks from institutional norms and applies for a patent at the USPTO. This is controversial internationally. Here in Europe, it was resisted principally on what were perceived to be ethical grounds. The USPTO ultimately issues the patent in 1980 based on the pending patent application. And in research I published elsewhere, the documentation of the agreements between the startup Genentech, founded by one of the scientists, and the agreement with the VC firm, and the agreement with Eli Lilly to produce and distribute are all predicated on the pending patent application. What is the patent doing there? It's structuring information between parties who could otherwise expropriate, seize the asset from the other. The transaction, the information exchange wouldn't be possible. Genentech doesn't have the capacity or the capital to do the testing, production, and distribution. Eli Lilly does. Genentech has the idea. What has the patent done? The patent has lowered the entry barrier. It's reduced the cost of capital for Genentech. The VC is investing in Genentech based on the expectation it can partner with Big Pharma. And Genentech can partner with Big Pharma because the property right insulates Genentech against being expropriated by its corporate partner. This template has been replicated. It was replicated by Stanford in almost 500 transactions, resulting in almost 2,500 products. It's been replicated ever since in the biotech industry. Here's a European example that you're probably familiar with, BioNTech Pfizer. I'm using too much time here, so I won't go through every step, but take my word for it. The biotech Pfizer partnership looks almost exactly the same as Genentech, Eli Lilly. It's the same story again. It's pulling tech out of the university. That is a public good at that stage. It's then structuring the relationship with Big Pharma. What do you get? You get an efficient division of labor. It accelerates time to market. It lowers entry barrier for the biotech firm. What patents did in the US biotech industry, and I believe the same is true, but to a somewhat lesser extent in Europe, it fundamentally changed the structure of the industry. The industry had consisted of vertically integrated firms. It moved to a disaggregated supply chain structure following standard division of labor principles. Every single function in the supply chain allocated to the firm that does it best. Innovation, as we know, often exhibits diseconomies of scale. It does better in smaller units. That's what the biotech startup firm is doing. Production, distribution, testing, those are classic economies of scale. The patent mediates these information exchanges that makes these transactions possible. All right, I'm almost done here. All right. The story of the biotech industry shows that patents often enhance innovation. Most economic observers agree with that, but they also, in many circumstances, enhance competition. They lower entry barriers for smaller firms, and these small firms play an important role. And the data we have tells us they keep playing a more and more important role in the biotech industry. I draw you to data below from the IQVIA Human Data Sciences Institute, which shows that emerging firms, by which they mean SMEs, are responsible for more than half of new drugs, reaching almost 60% of new drugs. This is a classic virtuous story of the role that IP rights play in terms of innovation and competition in the industry. And I'm gonna end there. If you're interested in more analysis on these topics, what I just presented to you is mostly reflected in a chapter in a book that our initiative is publishing later this year. There's a critical analysis of the economic evidence that our initiative published 2 years ago. And in 2021, I published a book that shows these relationships between IP rights and market structure across life sciences and all manner of IT industries. And that's Oxford University Press 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. So, Bo will let you kick off on.
Am I next?
You are next.
My format didn't make it. I had my fancy Berkeley format. All right, that's good. All right, so thanks a lot, Benoît. We had a conference, the DCI conference in Paris in the fall. David Bosco arranged, and the first presentation was Rich Gilbert talking about how to talk about innovation-centric competition policy and using the case of Illumina Grail as a relatively good example, not only just not for pharma, but just in general for how you think about static and dynamic analysis. Rich couldn't be here today. I know he would like to have been, and it's way too early in California. So I stepped into the breach And I'm going to discuss a bit of what Rich worked on, and I'm going to add a little bit of twist on my own in the end. So we'll go through this. I hope it's a good example. I look forward to your feedback, how it relates to all the other issues we discussed today. All right. So to begin the case of Illumina Grail, I'm going to do a little bit of a dynamic antitrust autopsy of the case. So it was a vertical merger with implications for dynamic harms and benefit. It included from the Grail side this multi-cancer early detection test, MCED tests. It was a potential breakthrough technology that aims to detect many cancers at early stage in development. So the idea is that you would take a blood test and little fragments of cancer cells would be detected, and you would find this out at a very early stage, stage 1 maybe, when they hadn't really metastasized completely, and then you could be treated much better. So it's a great development. But it does require this next generation gene sequencer from Illumina. So this NGS it's called. And a complex test that combines wet lab hardware and machine learning. So you have this mixture of this upstream sequencer from Illumina that's necessary in order to execute the MCED test from Grail. So that's the overview there. So the state of the MCED industry is that Illumina was and still is the dominant supplier of this short read next generation sequencing technology to analyze DNA. So they're still dominant supplier, and Grail sold and still sells the best MCED test. There are one other actor and possibly a third one coming on the market now, but this test, Galleria, was the one at the time that was on the market. Now, we'll get back to this a bit later, but it was on the market, but it wasn't necessarily completely tested to know whether it worked or not. In fact, at the time of this, there was a big NHS study to see over 3 years to see the efficacy of this test, to see if it works. So all this is being done even before there's an actual definitive clinical trial of whether the object of this merger is actually going to be useful for patients. All right. So the timeline of events, and we'll get back to this at the end. It's quite interesting, right? So if you didn't know this, Illumina founded Grail as a wholly owned subsidiary. So it's not that Grail was a startup company. It was created by Illumina. So Illumina and Grail were the same company, and Illumina spun out Grail and maintained a 12% ownership share. I didn't look into this, but I assume they wanted to get money, and I think from the market, and I think they got almost $2 billion in investment from the market. So they were in some way opening up further opportunities to gather outside funding. And then in 2021, they wanted to buy it back. So this is a quite interesting story. So it starts out inside, it's spun outside, and then they want it back. And this is good because when you think of when you apply this, and we'll do this later, to how antitrust thinks about this, each one of these scenarios in different ways can look at it from different perspectives, which gives us a little bit of an inside peek to why do we think about the exact same context in different ways. All right, we'll get to that later. So what happened was there was an administrative law judge. They dismissed the complaint. So there was a complaint to block the merger. They dismissed it. They said that the merger wasn't going to cause harm. Then the FTC Commission stepped in and reversed the ALJ. And then the Court of Appeals, the Fifth Circuit, upheld the FTC decision. And then in 2024, Illumina divested Grail. So there was, even though they remanded the case in the Court of Appeals, it was over issues that Illumina didn't think that they would overcome. So they went ahead and divested. So this is a little bit of the situation here. All right, so in the so there's a little bit about the contradicting analytical approaches. So when we get in and we look, so what were the different theories that the different courts used? So the administrative law judge, they used a static analysis. They basically looked at the case and looked for current competition. There was none. There was only Grail on the market. And they said that there was nothing that was a good substitute for Grail, so there wasn't able to, there was no competition. But when it went to the Federal Trade Commission, they used a more dynamic analysis, and they reversed the ALJ's decision and concluded that there was the possibility to foreclose nascent MSED test suppliers that may exist in the near term, but don't exist currently. So that's definitely a dynamic future theory of harm. So basically the thinking like this from the ALJ is that a vertical merger, single upstream firm with a single downstream firm. There are no other firms on the market, so there's no incentive to foreclose or to raise rivals' costs. Classic static analysis. The FTC comes in and says, well, these rivals, 1, 2, and how many ever, they're coming. We see them coming. They're not there. And so potentially they could foreclose, even though they don't exist yet. All right. So then the FTC, or then the Court of Appeals, looked at this question. So they focused on the foreclosure and the raising rival costs of the rivals that do not exist yet. That's what they looked at in appeal. They created a market definition for research, development, and commercialization. So not a market definition for other products on the market because there weren't any. So this was very important, how they defined the market. And then their assumptions and findings was that the MSED tests would appear, that rival tests would appear in the not so distant future, that Illumina cannot contract to capture downstream profits from those tests, that rival NGS machines, so the rival technology that Illumina controlled is not likely to come, so there won't be competitors for that, and that they rejected the double marginalization argument. So they confirmed the commission, the Federal Trade Commission, not to be confused with, usually when we say commission here, we mean European Commission, yeah. So that there was harm to competition. All right. So in the case, there was a number of rebuttals by Illumina on dynamic theories of efficiency. So I'm not going to go through all of them here, but learning by doing, and data network effects, the idea that if they got out quicker, they would generate more data, and this would improve and create more innovation. This complementaries idea about how to take complements and bring them together to internalize innovation externalities. We'll talk about that a little bit in a second as well. The dynamic reimbursement and regulatory capabilities. So they talked about the capabilities, that they weren't necessarily that easy to just replace these capabilities, which is what we've been talking about today. So they had very unique capabilities that fit well together. Also, not just the eliminating double marginalization, they talked about a more dynamic cost reduction based on an innovation effect. And also was interesting the faster creation of clinical evidence because there was only one almost, it was on the market, but it hadn't had definitive clinical evidence. It wasn't part of insurance schemes. It wasn't used within a lot of healthcare systems. So just the fact that together with Illumina, it would be more likely that they would be able to work and get this to become more accepted in a regulatory environment, which would help the whole industry. We talk about MSEDs, we mention them as if they're an existing market, but they're really just a new product that doesn't really have a complete, it's not reified in society yet. So sometimes you not only need to put a product on the market, you have to convince people that that product should be part of an overall part of clinical activity. All right. So the FTC and the appeals court were not moved by this. It's interesting because they were moved by the theory of harm, of dynamic theory of harm, about this hypothetical competitors that might come, but every time theories of efficiency were put forward, they're like, well, this sounds vague. You can't really substantiate it. Well, it is in the future, so it is hard to completely substantiate. But the theories of harm were able to be we're accepted under the same, I would argue, vagueness or inability to completely substantiate. And this leads to the ideas that Rich put forward in Paris, was that it's an uphill battle for U.S. courts. That classical efficiency defense is a claim that there is no harm to competition. U.S. courts have never allowed defendants to offset harm to competition with claimed benefits, static or dynamic, and that enforcers can exercise some prosecutorial discretion, but that can easily be challenged by the courts, so they often don't. So there's a little bit of the structural problem. And as Fred Genie, as you say, Fred, you can see the asymmetry of treating the harms and the benefits, not as a coherent discussion. All right, so what we could say in a more comprehensive dynamic analysis, suggestion is, does Illumina and Grail separately have unique capabilities? Would the combined companies have unique capabilities or incentives that would not be replicated? And are there other entry barriers to IP that are insurmountable? Some of these fundamental questions that you saw in the questions from Connie and Nicola. So just quickly, there is a paper now about innovation externalities for complements, which is an underappreciated benefit from vertical mergers. So markets for combinations of technologies like drugs, computer hardware and software, in this case, NGS machines and MCED tests. So this means the owner of the combination would internalize this innovation externality. And there's strong empirical evidence on trials of combinational drugs. Here's a reference from Dix and Lensman. So here's some more evidence that's useful for this type of argumentation. And so the possible evolution could be that there would be more both on the NGS level and also on the MCED level going into the future. So let me finish with some of the contradictions, or when I read through this with my viewpoint, that's stuck out a little bit to me on this case when I thought about it more after Rich introduced it, is that there seems to be contradictions of a law and economic reality that this, oops, I need to use this one, that there are different statutes or different theories from the courts, legal theories and evidentiary burdens in the three potential aluminum Grail market scenarios. So if we go back to this idea that Illumina did already own Grail, then it divested it, and then they wanted to merge or acquire it back, is that we have these three scenarios: merger, but there's also the idea of exclusive contract. And then if they didn't spin it out, this idea of duty to deal. So the thinking here would be that under merger, that was that was Section 7 of the Clayton Act. And if you wanted to do exclusive dealing, that would be Section 1 or Section 2 of the Sherman Act, maybe Section 3 of the Clayton Act, which would require a different set of evidence and burden that might have been more difficult for the government to win, even though the context would be almost the exact same if they had an exclusive license than if they did the merger, except maybe you wouldn't get the benefits of the merger. If they didn't spin out at all, they still would have had this exclusive position. This would have been the Sherman, Section 1 or 2 of the Sherman Act, and it would have been very difficult to claim that they would have a duty to deal under Trinco in the US. So it's interesting that if they would have stayed together, they could have had this strong position that no one was allowing to happen by allowing the merger, but they would have had it had they stayed together, and then that would have probably been okay or difficult. So yeah, so it's all over, right? And then of course, if you take it even further, you could say that what if Illumina claimed that their market power was based on intellectual property, which would be to some extent justifiable in the sense that, well, it's going to go out in 20 years, you know, like pharmaceutical patents do. And how would this have changed if it is thinking of an essential facility and duty to deal? So all these different things create these contradictions over the exact same context, but with different legal regimes and different reasoning. To make it more interesting, one last slide. Grail's cancer detection test fails in major study. So the people at Illumina are like, thank you, FTC. Thank you for blocking my merger. Saved me $8 billion. But it is interesting that a test that wasn't even sure that it was going to work was not allowed to merge with a company because other tests that we don't know if they work and don't even exist yet could be foreclosed. It's interesting. That is dynamic. I have to give them that. What's that? You did the case. Okay. Ed? Right. Were you skeptical? No, but I think at the commission, I didn't look at the commission, but I think they had the same thinking as FTC. You had a
different approach to potential entry. The US traditionally used that ahead of there. We don't have this situation in Europe, so it would have overreach.
Right. So I just thought it brought out a lot of interesting points. It's a little bit like in biology, the fruit fly, studying the fruit fly. This is like studying the fruit fly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bo. Actually, the commission lost the case on appeal, but not on the substance, on the Article 22. So we will never know what the court would have thought about the. Yeah, I know, because you worked for it. But that's an interesting contrast. So thank you, Bo, for this. This is certainly a case that has spilled some ink. I may not finish to do that. Kristina, we turn to you. As you know, the Commission is undergoing a review of its merger guidelines, and we know from Emanuele that we may have a draft of the guidelines by the end of this month. Let's see if that's true. But what are your thoughts on how this revised guideline could address innovation in pharma and merger?
Well, you've already kind of poo-pooed my presentation because I thought the draft was coming in May, so end of this month is earlier than my latest intel, but that's very interesting news. Well, first of all, it's fantastic to be here with all of you on this beautiful day in this beautiful place. I love coming here, and every time I come, I'm very envious of Nicolas because it's such a beautiful place. And of course, a fantastically interesting topic. I'm also slightly tempted to talk DMA, but I promise you, I will not do it. I will not mention it anymore. So I'm going to try to pick up some of the points made. I don't have time to go into detail of the review of the horizontal and vertical merger guidelines by the European Commission. And by the way, when I say Commission, I mean European Commission, to be clear. But I'll just try to pick out some themes. And I mean, there's been a lot of submissions, a lot of debate. There have been some workshops in Brussels. I've attended a few of them. So I'll just try to pick up some themes that I think are relevant to the pharmaceutical industry. Again, the draft is coming, whether it's end of April or May, it's soon. It will be very exciting. I think the plan is to try to adopt it by end of year. Is that your intel as well? Yeah, which again is very soon. It's a very ambitious project. And as I'm sure you know, it's very much at the center of policy in Brussels because it was very much at the center of the mission letter given by President von der Leyen to Commissioner Ribera. It's very much kind of tied into the whole debate around Draghi and, we need to have competitiveness, we need to have innovation. Somehow merger control is going to create innovation, which we may or may not believe is the right way to think about it. But anyway, I would note, as I always do when I mention Draghi, though, that the Draghi report, in my mind, is mainly about tech. So, I mean, I think a lot of the issues are relevant, of course, to pharma, and we'll discuss that now. But the whole kind of gap between the US is very much based on the tech industry, as Draghi very clearly sets out. But basically, what we're talking about today, and I'm sure you've heard it this morning, what we're part of the review of the merger guidelines is that I think there's a sense that the current analysis has been maybe a bit too static, a bit too formalistic. We're very focused on kind of structure-based criteria like market share, like market concentration. And we're very focused on short-term price effects. And I think, although, you know, I believe even in the commission that there's a lot of smart people trying to take better account of dynamic effects and of innovation and of efficiencies, I think we're all just a bit struggling how to kind of get there in the right way. And I don't envy the people drafting these guidelines. It's a really ambitious and important project. So a lot of it, of course, boils down to, again, what we're talking about today. How do we assess innovation effects? How do we get that into some sort of framework that makes sense and that gives us legal certainty? And how do we assess efficiencies? And again, I think many of us agree that that's necessary. It's necessary to have competitive tech and pharmaceutical markets. But there's a frustration again, because I think I'm right in saying that no single merger to date has ever been approved based on efficiencies or based on positive innovation effects. So we talk a lot about it, but at least in Europe, I don't think we've ever had an outcome actually based on that yet. So I'll touch briefly kind of on three themes or three points. My first one is kind of the most basic one. So how do we give appropriate weight in merger assessment to pro-competitive innovation effects? I think to date, at least in Europe, we've had a lot of focus on the kind of anti-competitive effects of combining R&D. We heard Dow DuPont mentioned earlier. That's, of course, the famous case. We had the famous innovation spaces that we were all struggling at the time to understand what they were. So there's been a lot of kind of focus on the negative effects of you know, less innovation resulting from horizontal mergers. Some might say there's almost been a presumption that if you combine two horizontal innovative companies, then you know, you'll have less innovation as a result. I defer to all of the brilliant economists in the room. I'm not an expert here, but I have read enough to know that the pharmaceutical sector is a very good example of a sector where innovation effects are actually much more complex and much more nuanced. There are lots of interesting papers and theories showing that even if you combine two kind of horizontally overlapping R&D projects or companies, that you know, the effects can be both negative and positive. There is, you know, there are things like demand expansion, there are diversion effects that can be positive or negative. There are, of course, economies of scale and scope. There can be innovation spillovers that can have very positive effects. And again, lots of reasons why innovation might actually increase and innovation incentives might actually increase even in a horizontal merger. So a basic point made by several kind of commentators in this guidelines review process is that already at the first stage, not at the efficiency stage, but the first stage of looking at the merger's effects, the Commission should really try to balance not just the negative, but also the positive effects before reaching a conclusion on whether or not there's a significant impediment to effective competition. Of course, this is not an easy exercise, and it does also maybe require some more flexibility in the framework in a number of ways. I think one important point, and I'll get back to that, is the timeframes. We might have to be more flexible in the timeframes because, of course, negative effects can occur more quickly than some of the positive innovation benefits, which might take a bit of a longer time. I mean, we've been talking about the time horizon of the pharma industry. I mean, clinical trials, very, very expensive and lengthy, and it takes a very, very long time to get through the whole regulatory process. So, you know, to see positive innovation effects might take a bit longer. So we might have to allow a bit of an asymmetry in the timeframes. We might also have to allow weighing positive innovation effects against other kinds of negative effects like price effects. So the assessment tends to want to weigh the same kind of effects against the same kind of positive and negative effects, but we might have to allow the offsetting of more short-term price effects by longer-term innovation incentive benefits. And another point that comes up quite often is the kind of outer market versus in market. I mean, the Commission tends to be quite strict, and there's some case law around this saying that you have to kind of benefit the same consumers or patients that are being harmed by price increases have to benefit from the innovation benefits, and that might make the assessment a bit narrow, and might mean that we prohibit mergers that might lead to huge innovation, although for maybe a different patient group or for a different technology or use. So that concludes my first point. I'd love to hear discussion and feedback, but I'll move on to my second point. Picks up very much on what Bo was saying, and is controversial in some respects. It goes to the what I think you called it, the asymmetry of assessing harms versus benefits. And this again comes up in several different contexts. I'll point to a few of them, but I think there's a sense maybe that the approach needs to be a bit more balanced between the requirements we put on the regulator showing negative effects of a merger versus the requirements we put on the merging parties to argue innovation, incentive benefits and efficiencies, and also in terms of standard of proof and evidence and so on. And this comes up, I think, in a number of contexts. I'll pick immediately. I'll pick yours up immediately, which I thought was brilliant. The Illumina Grail. I mean, I think, you know, having represented lots of pharma and tech companies in you know, for more than 2 decades now, I suspect I would not get very far if I went in and said, oh, but there's, you know, there's countervailing potential competition from non-existent future entrants. I'm not sure that's going to fly. So I think that's a very good example. And actually, that was my last point, but I'll start with that. That is a point that's been commented on quite a bit, the assessment of potential competition, because those standards are very different and the tests are very different. So in merger and antitrust cases, when the Commission looks at, you know, whether there's an elimination of a potential competitor in the pharma sector as a theory of harm, then you know, you look at the different stages of clinical trials that Benoît mentioned, but you know, I think we've been going further and further into very initial research, which, as was mentioned, is extremely uncertain in terms of whether there will actually be potential competition. And there's also, in the antitrust context, in the patent settlement cases, there's the approach that, you know, if you've taken steps, even if you don't have a marketing authorization, you know, you're considered a potential competitor. So I'm simplifying a little bit, but it goes kind of quite far. Versus on the other side of the coin, when the parties are trying to argue that, you know, there's a countervailing factor, competitive constraints from potential entrants or potential competitors, the test is quite strict, that entry has to be very likely, it has to be profitable, it has to be, you know, without any barriers, it has to be timely, which typically is kind of 2 years, and it has to be sufficient. And by the way, I think the time frame here, again, boy, if I'm right with Illumina Grail, the time frame was very, very long, right? I mean, very different from the kind of 2 years that you tend to say that parties have to show, right? So there's again that kind of asymmetry, and again the time frame I think is a key point. But there are also other examples of this kind of asymmetry. For example, looking at what is the counterfactual. When the regulator looks at a merger, the counterfactual is typically that the situation absent the merger. Whereas when the parties are arguing efficiencies or arguing for benefits, the counterfactual, I think, tends to be not just the situation absent merger, but also the situation, oh, but you could have done an agreement, you could have done a collaboration, you could have done something else that isn't what you're doing. So again, there's kind of an imbalance there. And also another example that's been mentioned is how do you measure? I mean, this is obviously very difficult, but how do you measure innovation? And of course, sometimes you might want to find proxies for that, and the Commission has been criticized in a case, probably in a couple of cases, but for example, for looking at numbers of patents, and without going into the details of patenting, of course, patents are very different. You have, you know, patents on fundamental innovation, you have patents on process, you have different patents, and of course you have patenting strategies. So how many patents you have might not necessarily translate to you know, the quality or actual you know, importance of the innovation. Whereas I think, at least in my experience, in some of these cases, the parties are held to quite strict and stringent requirements in terms of really showing what the innovation is. So that was my second point, and I'm sure there's more to say there, but I'll leave it for discussion. So the third point I'll just touch on very briefly. I think it's pretty obvious, but very important, which of course is remedies. And as you all know, the Commission tends to have a strong leaning towards structural remedies, which of course makes sense and is easier to kind of monitor, etc. But I think there's a good argument to be made that that's not always very suitable in innovation-heavy industries and in pharmaceutical markets. And we might need more flexibility. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if all of you are familiar with the CMA's Vodafone 3 decision. When was it? Last year? This year? Last year? Last year. Anyway, quite recent, where the CMA actually accepted kind of investment commitments that were monitored by a trustee. Sorry? Last year, yeah. So I mean, this was in telecoms, it was a different sector, but you know, they accepted investment commitments monitored by a trustee, and also I think there was some relevance and importance to the fact that there was a sector regulator also that you know had that could help monitor the market developments. And I mean, I think the same applies in pharma, right? I mean, you could you know, if the concern is less innovation, or that certain innovation programs would be discontinued, etc. You could structure remedies around that, and also, of course, as we all know, it's a very regulated market. Prices are not set freely; they are often set by regulators and health authorities. So yeah, we might want to see in the guidelines and in the future approaches some more flexibility on what remedies we might be able to agree and come up with. That's it.
Thank you, Kristina. Before I open the floor, and I can see Sven already putting his, I have a question for you, Jonathan, because you talked quite a deal about the patent system and its usefulness, but there's been recent discussion about secondary patents. The fact, I mean, I'm referring to an article by Hemphill and Sampot, we documented the fact that secondary patents, so those are not, secondary patents would be those that cover property of existing molecules, so there's not primary patent. And they are covered now nearly all the patent drugs in the US Orange Book, statistics from them. And whilst some of them may be very legitimate, there is concern that some of these patents may just be served primarily to delay entry of generic and without much generic value. So we have less essentially primary patent, which are generally new molecule, and the patent books is more about those secondary patents, just working around existing patents and molecules. So what's your take on this as an expert in this life science?
We're going to tag team on this because
you're going to tackle both of you. Okay,
yeah.
Good.
Bo might have something to add on this particular topic. The first thing I wanted to say is just to qualify or to clarify the main point. I said that the evidence tells us that patents and IP rights in a meaningful form are critical to every known business model in biopharma innovation, and especially SME innovation. But that still maintains a very rich space for policy discussion about particular features and term and scope and so forth. And that's where your question comes in, which is a perfectly valid question. I believe you're referring to the practice, which is alleged by some commentators, that some of the patenting activity of pharma companies is strategically designed to extend the patent term. And I think the empirical debate on that is open, and that there have been serious analysis, some of which our initiative has published, which suggests that at least some of those secondary patents are socially valuable insofar as they are covering meaningful improvements, to existing small molecule innovations, or they may be socially valuable patents that are covering new dosages, new delivery mechanisms, and so forth.
Yeah, I think the term is used as evergreening. Yeah, so it's a strange theoretically, empirically, it breaks down very quickly, but it tends to run around the world, as a narrative. Because let's look at Ozempic or these GLP-1 drugs now for weight loss, and they now have a pill, right? I think you see it. They're on TV all the time. So now they have a pill. So before that, you had to do an injection. So should you not be incentivized to produce the pill? Now they have they have an injection that you do every day. Then they created an injection that you only need to do once a week. Now maybe once a month. And now a pill that you only need. So these are valuable. And the thing is that what's often said is that, well, this extends their monopoly, not on the original, right? So when the patents wear out, which they are in most of the world except the US in the next year or so, you can create a generic version of the injection, once a day. And that's pretty good because that can be pretty cheap. But if you didn't allow for this follow-on innovation, then you wouldn't get it, right? And you don't have to take it. You can use the older version. So the logic is very strange. And when you look at it, it doesn't hold up generic entry. And if it did, it wouldn't be because of the patent system. It would be for some other factors. So it seems to be easy to blame the patent system. But when you scratch below the surface, it's obviously, the thing that Jonathan and I like to say is that, without the patent system, we wouldn't be having this argument. People say the drug prices are too high. What's the price on a drug that doesn't exist? Because the patent system brings the drug into existence, so we can we can cry about the price for a few years before it becomes cheap and useful for the rest of humanity. It's not a bad system, but it doesn't fit on a hat very easily, right? And I think that's where we struggle to make the communication.
Thank you. Thank you, Will. Sven, you've been waiting.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment and sort of combine Kristina and Bo's introductions. As Kristina said, often there's a feeling that when you present the dynamic efficiency, then you come up against harm that's immediate and you're sort of thrown off the table. And actually, Illumina Grail had a potential mirror image to that situation, because the harm that might have come would have been far down the road, right? The court said, well, there's competition going on right now in innovation, but the actual harm would have been that some products would not come to in the hands of the consumers several years down the road, right? The consumers will not feel anything immediately, right? On the other hand, the parties tried to come with they came with several efficiency arguments, as you said, but one of them was elimination of double modernization, which was not accepted. If that had been accepted, that would have been an efficiency that would have come immediately, that then would have had to be weighed against uncertain harm several years down the road for the consumers. So it's just an interesting little thought.
I can just add that Illumina did offer to not block other rivals from using their technology. That wasn't necessarily convincing by the court either, because they still were claimed to have an incentive to not really want to do that, even though they claimed that they would.
If there were past behavior.
Yeah, past behavior to show that, yeah.
That suggested you couldn't trust.
Well, a comment for Bo and a question for Jonathan. Not mentioned in Illumina Grail is that they screwed up the market definition because they decided that the only relevant category was sort of DNA-based diagnostics. And I actually am chairman of the board of a company with a blood-based and plasma-based diagnostic that'll blow Grail out of the water. The website's been there, the data's been there. Nobody knocked on the door to ask about whether this was a competitive force, but nevertheless, the FTC seemed to be able to do forward projections with respect to other aspects of this case, but they couldn't even bother to knock on the door of a company that was already in the marketplace. It's been there for 27 years. Anyway, that's just a comment that they screwed up market definition as well by being too narrow. The question for Jonathan is, it is, but we've known that for a long time. Would have been happy to tell the agencies that. Absolutely buy completely into the synergy between the small biotech companies and big pharma. And it seems to me, if I'm right, that both big pharma and the small biotech companies are pro-patent. But then you move over into electronics and computers and cell phones, and you find the implementers, the equivalent of big pharma, are anti-patent, and the little guys are left out in the cold, so to speak. What is the politics behind that? Is it just crass self-interest on the part of implementers, or is there something different that enables big pharma to be more sympathetic and willing to deal, if you will, than in the other sector?
Since we're talking economics, it's 100% self-interest. So the answer is that when we get outside of biopharma, the analysis becomes more complex and more interesting, because we do have business models, especially in software-based industries, that do not rely on formal IP. And therefore, we have a clash of business models where we have firms that, for example, specialize in chip design, but they're not vertically integrated into production and distribution. They're relying on the IP system to license that out and monetize the R&D. Whereas if you're an OEM device maker in almost any electronics market, that IP coming down from the upstream part of the supply chain is an input cost. And just like your ice cream store, a restaurant, or apparel store, you want to get those input costs down to zero. And as I've discussed in my latest book, To Shamelessly Self-Market, implementers in the US at least have taken every action possible to lobby for an IP system that pushes those input costs as low as possible, with the magic number being zero.
I had to give you a softball.